A modern F-16 fighter jet shot down over Ukraine. A hero pilot taken down while trying to save civilians from Vladimir Putin's brutal attacks. And an entire country trying to stand strong against airstrikes that feel more like swarms of bees than any kind of conventional military operation. On June 29, 2025, Ukraine went through the biggest air assault since the war began. Over 150 Russian drones and missiles launched at the same time in the middle of the night. A coordinated strike, ruthless and effective. The fall of the Ukrainian F-16 wasn't just a tactical setback. It was a harsh wake-up call to the West. A symbol that the war has shifted. That even the most advanced fighter jets in the world can be outmatched by cheap drones with civilian engines and off-the-shelf GPS. But the real question echoing through all this runs deeper. Are we ready for the new battlefield? A battlefield where it's not about raw firepower, but the speed of your response, the intelligence packed into the system, the ability to tie everything together, man, machine, and algorithm, in real time. In this special episode, we're diving into the backstage of modern air warfare to understand what's breaking down, what needs to evolve, and what Ukraine is teaching us about courage, adaptation, and the limits of Western power. And to guide us through this talk, we've got Chris Turner back with us, former Navy SEAL, combat veteran, and international security analyst. With decades of boots-on-the-ground experience and a sharp eye on the geopolitical game, Turner helps us get why the future of war is already here and how it's being shaped right now, up in Ukraine's skies. Chris, let's cut straight to what really matters today. Since January 2025, Russia's been cranking up its air attacks in a way we hadn't seen before. And by the end of June, we witnessed something historic, probably the biggest coordinated airstrike since this special operation began. We're talking about more than 700 drones and missiles fired in a single night. In the middle of all that chaos, we lost another Ukrainian F-16, this time flown by Lieutenant Colonel Maxim Ustimenko. What does that moment represent from your perspective?
Look, when you analyze the numbers coldly, what we're seeing is a terrifying evolution in Russia's saturation capability. It's no longer the old pattern of 50, 60 projectiles like we used to see at the start. Now it's 700, 800 threats up in the sky at the same time. And that's no coincidence, it's a calculated strategy that hits right at the core vulnerability of Ukraine's air defense, the brutal math of interceptors.
Can you break that math down a little better? Because for folks who aren't in the military, it might sound like it's just a matter of having more defensive missiles.
It's way more complicated than that. Picture this, you've got a Patriot system, probably the most advanced one Ukraine has right now. Each interceptor costs somewhere between $3 to $6 million. On the other side, you've got an Iranian Shahid drone that maybe costs 20 grand to produce. When Russia launches 400 cheap drones along with 300 cruise and ballistic missiles, it forces Ukraine into impossible choices. Do you take out the cheap drone and burn through a multi-million-dollar missile, or do you let it through and risk it hitting something critical?
And that's exactly the kind of situation where Ustimenko lost his life, right? He was trying to intercept those threats when he was shot down.
Exactly. And here we've got to be really careful with the facts. What we know officially is that Ustimenko managed to shoot down 7 aerial targets before he was hit. 7 targets is no small thing when you're flying solo on a night with hundreds of threats overhead. According to the Ukrainian Air Force, his aircraft was damaged during engagement with the last target and started losing altitude. What happened after that, we can only speculate, based on patterns we've seen in past cases.
And that specific attack, how did it start? Because from the reports, it sounds like it was a very well-orchestrated operation.
It really was. It kicked off around 2 in the morning, following a pattern Russia's been fine-tuning for months. First comes the wave of Shahid drones, those modified Iranian ones that fly low and slow. They're not the deadliest individually, but they force every radar system to light up and make the defense waste ammunition. Then, after about 2 hours, when the systems are already partially drained, that's when the real punch lands: caliber cruise missiles, Iskander ballistic missiles, and a few Kinzhal hypersonics that are practically impossible to intercept.
And what were the actual damages from that attack? Because we hear a lot of propaganda from both sides, but what was really hit?
Okay, let's stick to verifiable facts. At least 3 power substations were knocked offline, leaving big parts of Kyiv and other cities without electricity for several hours. A refinery in the Poltava region was hit and went up in flames. But what really caught my eye were the military targets they confirmed, at least 2 ammunition depots in western Ukraine, supposedly storing Western-supplied weapons. And here's the tricky part, some of those targets were way behind the front lines, which suggests Russian intelligence is working better than we'd like to admit.
And the Ukrainian response? Was there any kind of equivalent retaliation?
Ukraine tried to respond the following week with drone strikes on Russian air bases, especially that operation against Engels Air Base, where they supposedly managed to damage some Tu-95 strategic bombers. But let's be honest here, it's nowhere near the same level of saturation. Ukraine just doesn't have the means to launch 700 projectiles in a single night. Every operation they run has to be way more selective, way more calculated.
Chris, one thing I keep wondering is how an F-16, which is considered a modern fighter, ends up being shot down in a mission like this. Shouldn't it have more advanced defense systems?
That's an excellent question, and the answer gets right to the heart of the challenges Ukraine is facing. The F-16 is a modern fighter, sure, but it's not invincible. And when you're flying night interception missions, especially at low altitude chasing slow drones, it becomes vulnerable. Ostemenko was probably so locked in on taking down those 7 targets that he may have lost situational awareness about other threats in the airspace. Could have been a surface-to-air missile, could have even been friendly fire, something that, unfortunately, happens when you've got dozens of defense systems firing all at once in the dark.
Chris, I'd like us to talk a little more about the pilots we've already lost. Because it's not just Ostemenko, right? There was Alexei Moonfish last August, Pavlo Ivanov in April, and each of those guys has a story.
They sure do, and their story's worth telling. Alexei Mes, who went by the callsign Moonfish, was the first F-16 pilot Ukraine lost. That was in August 2024, during what was, up to that point, considered Russia's biggest air assault. The guy managed to shoot down 3 cruise missiles before being taken out. Imagine what could have happened if those missiles had reached their targets.
And what do we know about the personalities of these pilots? Because we always hear the technical side, but people forget they're real human beings with real lives.
Mes, for example, was a veteran of Soviet-era fighters before transitioning to the F-16. He basically had to relearn everything, from starting up the jet to engaging targets. But what impressed everyone who worked with him was his dedication. The guy would spend extra hours in the simulator, studying manuals in English, which wasn't even his first or second language. He was obsessive about safety details.
And Pavlo Ivanov, who was shot down in April.
Ivanov was younger, 26 years old. He came from the Su-25, those ground attack aircraft that are very different from the F-16. The transition must have been brutal for him. What sticks with me about his story is that he was shot down on a mission in eastern Ukraine, in the Sumy region, probably by a Russian S-400 system firing from afar. Those systems can hit targets from 400 kilometers away. You might think you're flying safe, and then suddenly you're taken out.
It's hard to imagine the psychological pressure on these guys. Flying with the knowledge that there's a system out there that can reach you from that far away.
Yeah, it's brutal. And let me tell you something people don't talk about much, these pilots know exactly what the odds are. They know flying F-16s in Ukraine today isn't like flying with NATO, with AWACS coverage, suppression of enemy defenses, that whole protective network. It's you, on your own, against an integrated air defense system that was designed specifically to take down fighters like yours.
And what's amazing is that even so, they keep flying.
True, and that brings us back to Ostemenko, who we lost in June. The guy was a lieutenant colonel, meaning he was an experienced officer. He was 32, had a family. And on the most dangerous night since the conflict began, he got into that F-16 and managed to take down 7 threats before being hit. 7 missiles and drones that didn't make it to their targets. How many lives did that save?
Do you think there's a pattern in these losses? Some tactical lesson that can be learned?
Sadly, yes. Almost all these losses happened during night interception missions, in situations where the defense systems were being massively saturated. What that tells me is that Ukraine's being forced to use the F-16s in missions they weren't ideally designed for. An F-16 should be operating with AWACS coverage, with suppression of enemy defenses, as part of an integrated system. Instead, they're being used almost like lone interceptors, trying to stop massive waves of drones and missiles.
And is that sustainable in the long run?
Honestly? No. If you keep losing experienced pilots at this rate, at some point you just run out of qualified people to fly. And training a new F-16 pilot isn't a matter of weeks, it's months, sometimes years to reach the level of proficiency needed. Every pilot lost is years of investment gone in an instant.
Chris, let's talk about the real situation with Ukraine's F-16 fleet. How many do they actually have? Where do they come from? And what's the real operational condition of these jets?
That's a question that comes with a lot of speculation, because the exact numbers are obviously classified. But based on open sources and official announcements, Ukraine has probably received somewhere between 20 to 30 F-16s so far. Most came from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium. But here I need to make an important distinction: receiving the plane is not the same as having full operational capability.
What do you mean by that?
An F-16 isn't just an airplane, it's a whole complex system that needs an entire infrastructure around it. You need very specific spare parts, special fuel, compatible weapons, maintenance systems, trained personnel. And more importantly, you need pilots who not only know how to fly the machine but also understand how to integrate it with the rest of their Air Force and air defense network.
And is that integration working?
Partially. Ukraine's in the middle of a massive transition, moving away from Soviet-era equipment and doctrine to NATO standards. Imagine working for 20 years with one kind of system and then suddenly having to learn everything all over again, right in the middle of a special operation, under constant pressure. It's no small thing.
And what about maintenance for those fighters? Can Ukraine handle that internally?
That's one of the biggest vulnerabilities in this operation. Most of the specialized maintenance still depends on outside support. Foreign technicians, parts shipped in from abroad, specialized equipment Ukraine's still trying to acquire. That means every F-16 that takes damage could be grounded for weeks or even months.
And when you lose an F-16, like the 3 that we've already confirmed, what's the real impact?
It's devastating on multiple levels. Financially, each F-16 represents something like $30 to $50 million, depending on its configuration. But the operational cost goes way beyond that. You lose years of pilot training, you lose the confidence of other crews, you lose air defense capability at a time when it's desperately needed.
And compared to the Soviet fighters they used before, the MiG-29s and Su-27s, does the F-16 really make that much of a difference?
Technologically, yes. The F-16's got more modern avionics, better sensors, the ability to engage multiple targets at once. But all that technology only works if you know how to use it right. And that brings us back to the integration problem. A MiG-29 flown by someone with 1,000 flight hours can be more effective than an F-16 flown by someone with just 100 hours of transition training.
Speaking of numbers, how many qualified F-16 pilots does Ukraine actually have?
That's probably the biggest bottleneck in the whole operation. Training a brand new F-16 pilot takes more than a year. Ukraine had to take experienced Soviet fighter pilots and put them through an accelerated conversion. From what's publicly known, they've got something like 20 to 40 pilots with some level of F-16 qualification. When you lose 3 in less than a year, that's a huge percentage of your total capacity gone.
And is there a plan to train more pilots?
There is, yeah, there are training programs running in several NATO countries. But that takes time, and time is the one thing they don't have. Meanwhile, the pilots already flying are taking on way more missions than would be ideal, piling on stress and fatigue.
Chris, this discussion about the F-16 fleet makes me think of a bigger issue. Ukraine has already lost at least 3 F-16s since it started receiving them back in August 2024. Each of those losses represents a massive investment, but before we get into the numbers, let me ask you this. What's the real operational impact when you lose one of these flying machines? And why is each lost F-16 so much more than just one less jet in the hangar?
Man, it's devastating on multiple levels, and let me explain why. Let's start with the basics. Every F-16 Ukraine receives isn't just a jet, it's literally a complete combat platform. When they lost their first F-16 in August 2024, with pilot Alexei Munfishmes, it wasn't just one aircraft taken out of service. It was an entire air defense system that got compromised.
But help me understand this complete system idea better. What exactly does Ukraine lose besides the physical aircraft?
Think of it like this, it's as if you didn't just lose the car, but also the skilled mechanic, the instruction manual, and the specialized garage all at once. Each F-16 comes integrated with advanced radar systems, electronic warfare capabilities, satellite navigation systems, and most importantly, the ability to carry a wide variety of weapons. We're talking AIM-120 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles, laser-guided bombs, HARM anti-radiation missiles. When you lose the jet, you lose all that multi-role capability.
And then there's the specific training tied to every pilot that's lost.
Exactly, and that's where it gets really tough. You know how many Ukrainian pilots are being trained to fly these F-16s? According to the latest data, only about 20 to 30 pilots in total, across training programs in Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK, and Romania. That's right, fewer than 30 guys to operate dozens of jets that Western allies are promising.
Wait, fewer than 30 pilots. That sounds ridiculously low for the size of the challenge Ukraine's up against. How does that training process even work? And how long does it take to make a competent pilot?
It is really low, and there's a very specific reason for it. F-16 training is an absolutely complex process. First, they've got to go to the UK just to brush up their English, because every manual, every communication system, every operational procedure is in English. Then they head to Denmark, where they train on Norwegian F-16s for the basics, or to the Netherlands and Romania for more advanced courses.
And how long does that take from start to finish?
Anywhere between 18 to 24 months to turn out a truly competent pilot. And here's an interesting detail: Denmark has already announced it's going to stop training Ukrainian pilots at the end of 2024 because they're switching over to F-35s. That puts even more pressure on the other countries in the coalition. So yeah, it's years of investment to form each pilot, and when you lose one, like with Alexei M.S., Pavlo Ivanov, and the third pilot we lost in July, you're not just losing a person. You're losing years of accumulated knowledge.
And financially, we're talking astronomical numbers, right?
Man, the figures will make your head spin. Each jet costs between $30 to $50 million, but that's just the start. The full package of training, logistical support, and spare parts that the US approved back in May this year was $310.5 million. And that's just to get things rolling. When you add it all up, pilot training, maintenance team formation, base adaptation, compatible communication systems, every operational F-16 in Ukraine represents a total investment of around $80 to $100 million.
So when you lose one of these jets, you're literally burning through $100 million?
Worse than that. You're burning through $100 million that take years to rebuild. It's not like buying a new car over the weekend. You've got to train a new pilot, train a new maintenance crew, and here's the crucial point most people don't get: every lost jet hits the morale and operational capacity of the whole unit. The other pilots see their buddies getting taken out, and that creates massive psychological pressure.
And that brings us to the deeper question of sustainability. How does Ukraine keep an operation like this going when every loss has such a huge impact? And more importantly, what's the real tactical impact on the battlefield when these capabilities are lost?
And this is where the cruel math of modern defense kicks in. Take the most recent case, in May this year. The pilot managed to shoot down 3 cruise missiles and a drone before the jet suffered a critical failure. He had to eject, but in the process he saved an entire populated area. Now imagine if that F-16 was still available for the next wave of attacks. How many more lives could it have saved? But there's an even more serious aspect: every F-16 lost forces the Ukrainians to completely reorganize their entire air defense tactics. They've got so few jets that losing one means rethinking entire sectors of airspace coverage. It's like having a soccer team with only 11 players and then losing a starter. You can't just sub in another one.
And that must put a massive psychological strain on the pilots that remain.
Exactly. And here's a human factor we can't overlook. These Ukrainian pilots are veterans who've been flying MiG-29s and Su-27s for decades. When they transition to the F-16, it's not just learning a new jet, it's literally changing their whole combat philosophy. The Soviet fighters were designed for quick interception and short-duration fights. The F-16 is a multi-mission platform that demands a completely different tactical mindset. Losing comrades in the middle of that adaptation process creates trauma that goes way beyond the operational level.
Chris, this brings us to a fundamental issue about how this conflict is being fought. It looks like Russia has found a way to make air defense economically unsustainable. How does this strategy work, and why is it so effective?
Man, they've created what I call the economic air defense trap, and it's a diabolically effective strategy. Here's how it works. They send out massive swarms of Shahid drones that cost about $35,000 each, according to the most recent estimates from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. These drones are mixed in with more sophisticated missiles in coordinated attacks. Ukraine answers back with interceptors that cost anywhere between $400,000 and $4 million each.
And that cost difference is being exploited systematically?
Systematically and brutally efficiently. Let me give you some concrete numbers. Since September 2024, Russia has drastically increased the use of Shahids, going from about 200 launches per week to more than 1,000 per week in March 2025. That's right, more than 1,000 drones per week. Now multiply that by the interception cost. Even if Ukraine uses the cheapest available solution, like the Coyote interceptors that cost $130,000 each, you're still talking about a cost gap of almost 4-to-1 in favor of the attacker.
But this isn't just about math, right? There's a whole strategic dimension behind this saturation.
Exactly. Russia's strategy isn't only about draining financial resources, it's about creating what they call drone saturation. It doesn't matter if one individual drone is shot down successfully. What matters is that you force the defense system to spend precious resources constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's pure attrition warfare, but fought in the defense budget instead of only on the traditional battlefield.
And how is Ukraine responding to that strategy? Because I imagine they can't just accept that unfavorable equation.
They're trying several interesting approaches. First, they're developing cheaper interception solutions, interceptor drones that cost a few $1,000s instead of hundreds of thousands. Second, they're investing heavily in electronic warfare to bring down Shahids without spending physical missiles. And third, and maybe most importantly, they're taking the fight into Russian territory.
You're talking about Ukraine's drone attacks on Russian targets.
Exactly. And here's a fascinating twist. Ukraine has managed to flip the cost equation in some cases. They're using drones that cost about $400 each to destroy Russian equipment worth millions. In January of this year, Ukrainian drones launched from maritime platforms destroyed Russian Panzer S-1 systems that cost around $20 million each. That's a cost-benefit ratio of 50,000 to 1 in Ukraine's favor.
That's a complete game changer.
It's a revolution in how we think about modern warfare. But there's an important catch. While Russia can produce and import Shahids at industrial scale, Ukraine's production capacity is still growing. The numbers we have show that Ukraine produced around 800,000 drones in 2023, 2 million in 2024, and is planning to produce up to 5 million in 2025. But even then, they still depend a lot on Western allies for the more sophisticated interception systems.
And this industrial capacity issue makes me think about something deeper. It seems like we're seeing a fundamental change in the very nature of defense logistics. What do you think this means for future conflicts?
Man, that's probably the most important lesson this conflict is going to leave for military strategists worldwide. Modern war isn't just defined by technological superiority anymore, it's defined by the ability to sustain high-intensity operations over long stretches of time. And here's the key difference between how Americans and Europeans think about defense versus how countries like Russia, Iran, and China structure their capabilities.
Explain that difference in approach better.
Simple, the West developed high-precision, high-cost defense systems designed for fast and decisive conflicts. A Patriot missile has an extremely high interception rate, but it costs $4 million. The Russian and Iranian philosophy is different. They bet on volume, on saturation, on long, drawn-out attrition wars. It's the difference between owning a Ferrari built for Formula One versus having a fleet of trucks to work in a mine. Both approaches work, but for completely different purposes.
And that's forcing the West to rethink its defense strategies?
Totally. The Americans are already working on cheaper interceptors, like Israel's Iron Beam system that uses a laser instead of physical missiles. That drops interception costs from hundreds of thousands of dollars to just a few bucks in electricity. But putting that into large-scale use takes time, and Ukraine needs solutions right now.
Chris, that brings us to another fascinating aspect of this conflict. Ukraine is operating what looks like a Rayon museum of air defense technologies, Soviet systems from the 1970s, ultramodern Western equipment, improvised adaptations. How does all that mixing work in practice? And more importantly, does it really work?
It's both a logistical nightmare and an operational fascination, to be totally honest. Picture trying to make a sound system work where you've got speakers from the 70s, amps from the 90s, and a super modern mixer, and each component speaks a different language. But here's an interesting twist: that apparent chaos has actually created some unexpected tactical advantages. Ukraine is running Soviet S-300s alongside American Patriots, German Iris-T, Norwegian NASAMS, and now their own Ukrainian-made systems like the interceptor drones they developed. Each one has its own logic, its own protocols, its own quirks. But you know what happened? That diversity ends up confusing Russian attackers too.
How so? In what way does that chaos turn into an advantage?
Think about it like this: if you were planning an attack against a defense system, you'd need to know the specific characteristics of that system. Radar frequencies, response patterns, technical vulnerabilities. When Russia developed its tactics to saturate air defenses, they mostly based them on knowledge of Soviet systems, the ones they themselves helped design, and on intelligence about standard Western systems. But when you've got a Soviet S-300 working in coordination with an American Patriot and a German Iris-T, operated by technicians who came up with improvised communication protocols, you're looking at a hybrid system that doesn't exist in any military manual on Earth. The Russians can't predict exactly how that technological Frankenstein will react.
That's brilliant, but I imagine it creates massive practical problems for Ukrainian operators.
It does, and some of those problems are serious. The Soviet systems were designed during the Cold War to defend Moscow from American B-52 bombers flying in formation. The Patriot, meanwhile, was developed by the Americans to defend against those very same missiles the Soviets might launch. Getting those two to talk to each other is practically a miracle of engineering. Sometimes you've got radars that can't share data with launchers from another system. Or operators who get alerts with a delay because the systems aren't fully integrated. There have even been documented cases where two different systems fired at the same target, wasting precious missiles.
And how do they solve those incompatibilities in practice?
With a lot of creative improvisation and real-time adaptation. They've set up command centers where technicians from different countries work side by side, Ukrainian specialists on Soviet systems, German consultants for the Iris-T, American technicians for the Patriot. It's like having an orchestra where every musician is reading sheet music in a different language, but they're all trying to play the same symphony. And here's something interesting: they've developed visual and gesture-based communication protocols for critical situations. When electronic systems fail or get overloaded during mass attacks, operators fall back on almost analog methods to coordinate responses.
But that must be incredibly stressful for the operators, especially during real attacks.
Man, the psychological pressure is insane. Imagine being in a control room, missiles flying toward your city, and you've got seconds to decide which system to use, weighing cost, effectiveness, missile availability, and coordination with other systems. And all this while alarms are going off, communications are overloaded, and you know one wrong decision could mean a hospital or a school gets hit.
And then there's the issue of training. How do you even train operators to use this hybrid system?
That's one of the most impressive parts of Ukraine's adaptation. They created hybrid simulators that didn't exist before this conflict. Basically, they took training software from different systems and built interfaces that let operators train for coordinating incompatible systems. But most of the real learning happens in the field, during actual attacks. It's learning under fire, literally. And here's an important human element: these operators have developed a sort of collective intuition. They can tell, just from the tone of a colleague's voice, whether a specific system is overloaded or needs to be swapped out.
That makes me think about long-term sustainability. Can this improvised system keep working indefinitely, or is there a limit to this adaptation?
There is a limit, and it's got multiple dimensions. First, human fatigue. These operators have been under extreme stress for more than 2 years. Second, equipment degradation. Soviet systems from the 70s running 24/7 in combat conditions are eventually going to fail, and spare parts are harder and harder to get. Third, and maybe most important, is the evolution of threats. The Russians are constantly adapting their tactics to exploit the weaknesses of this hybrid system. They've developed new jamming frequencies, new attack patterns, new types of drones designed specifically to confuse improvised defenses.
So it's a constant technological arms race.
Exactly, but with a crucial difference: Russia can plan and develop countermeasures in labs and research centers, while Ukraine has to adapt and innovate in real time, under bombardment. It's like being in a Formula One race where one driver can stop in the pits to fix the car, while the other has to repair it while driving 300 kilometers per hour.
And looking to the future, do you think this salad of systems is going to influence how other countries think about air defense?
It already is. Several NATO countries are reviewing their air defense doctrines to incorporate lessons learned in Ukraine. The idea that you need perfectly integrated systems is being questioned. Maybe diversity and unpredictability are actually valid tactical advantages. On the other hand, this is also accelerating the development of more flexible integration systems. The next generation of air defenses will probably be designed from the ground up to work in hybrid environments, where equipment from different eras and origins has to function together. Ukraine, unintentionally, has become the testing ground for the future of global air defense. Every adaptation, every successful improvisation, every failure is being studied by militaries all over the world. It's a revolution in how we think about defense system integration, and it's happening in real time, under the harshest possible conditions.
And that creates coordination problems.
It creates serious problems. The Soviet systems were designed during the Cold War to defend Moscow from American B-52 bombers. The Patriot, meanwhile, was developed by the Americans to defend against the very same missiles the Soviets could launch. Getting those two to talk to each other is almost a miracle of engineering. Sometimes you've got radars that just can't share data with launchers from another system.
There must be cases where that caused real problems.
There are, yeah, and some situations are pretty worrying. There've already been documented cases where two different systems fired at the same target, wasting precious missiles. Or even worse, situations where systems tripped over each other, creating interference. In some cases, operators got alerts with delays because the systems weren't properly integrated.
And how do they solve that?
With a lot of improvisation and real-time adaptation. They built makeshift command centers where technicians of different nationalities work side by side, trying to make that symphony play. But just imagine the complexity: you've got operators trained on Soviet systems who now have to coordinate with specialists on German equipment. It's like having an orchestra where every musician is reading sheet music in a different language.
And all this in the middle of an active conflict, under constant bombardment.
Exactly. It's not like peacetime, where you've got months to test, calibrate, and train. They're literally learning and adapting while missiles are flying right at them. And here's an important comparison: even NATO countries with billion-dollar budgets and decades of experience struggle to integrate air defense systems from different origins. Now imagine trying to do that under heavy fire.
Is there any positive aspect to this diversity of systems?
There actually is. That diversity also confuses the enemy. Russia can't just use a single saturation strategy because each system has its own characteristics and specific vulnerabilities. The S-300 has weaknesses that the Patriot covers, and vice versa. So in a way, that technological confusion ended up creating a layered defense that's more robust than any one system operating alone.
It's almost like improvisation turned into a tactical advantage.
That's one way to look at it. The unpredictability of Ukraine's system forces Russian attackers to diversify their tactics too. They can't just saturate one specific type of defense because there are multiple systems running at the same time. But that doesn't change the fact that integration is still a daily challenge for Ukrainian operators.
And looking ahead, do you think this salad of systems will keep being the reality?
For now, they don't have a choice. Ukraine can't afford to turn down equipment just because it's not the standard they'd prefer. If an air defense system shows up, whether it's American, German, French, or even modernized Soviet adaptations, they'll use it. The priority is keeping the skies protected, even if that means running this complex technological puzzle. The thing is, every new piece of that puzzle requires specific training, specialized maintenance, and its own logistics. It's a challenge that goes way beyond the battlefield. It's a test of endurance for the entire military and technical infrastructure of the country.
Chris, when we think about the classic image of military aviation, those Top Gun movies always come to mind, right? Jets slicing through the sky, pilots in high-speed dogfights, all that adrenaline. But looking at what's happening today in Ukraine and other theaters of operation, it seems like that narrative has completely changed. What changes do you consider the most significant?
Man, absolutely everything has changed. And it's not just a tactical shift, it's a full-on revolution in how we think about air power. Before, dominating the skies meant having the fastest jets, the most experienced pilots, the most advanced technology. Today, a $1,000 commercial drone can take down a $30 million F-16. That's a reality that's still tough to digest in traditional military circles.
That's really striking. You're talking about a total inversion of military logic, right?
Exactly. Let me give you a concrete example. In the spring of 2024, we saw documented cases where Iranian Shahed drones, which cost about $20,000 each, managed to overwhelm defense systems worth hundreds of millions. The problem isn't necessarily the individual effectiveness of these drones, but the saturation strategy. It's like trying to stop a hailstorm with an umbrella. Even if you block 90%, the 10% that get through cause significant damage.
And this saturation strategy is really working?
It works in a devastating way, and not just because of the physical damage. The psychological effect is brutal. Imagine being a radar operator having to identify and prioritize 50 simultaneous targets, knowing that if you miss even one, it could cost lives. That creates operational fatigue that erodes defense system effectiveness over time. Recent data shows that the effectiveness of air defense systems can drop by as much as 30% when subjected to prolonged saturation attacks.
That completely changes the role of the traditional pilot too, right?
A radical change. The modern pilot isn't the lone knight of the skies anymore. He's become part of an integrated network of sensors, artificial intelligence, and command systems. A Ukrainian F-16 pilot today doesn't make isolated decisions. He gets data from satellites, ground-based radars, reconnaissance drones, and electronic intelligence systems, all processed by algorithms suggesting the best actions.
But doesn't that make the system more vulnerable? If you compromise the network, doesn't everything get paralyzed?
You just hit the nerve of the issue. Relying on integrated networks creates massive cyber vulnerabilities. We've seen documented cases where Russian attacks temporarily disrupted communication links between Ukrainian fighters and their command centers. During those blackouts, the pilots were basically flying blind. The response to this has been heavy investment in onboard artificial intelligence and autonomous systems that can function independently of the network.
So we're moving toward military aviation where technology matters more than human skill?
I wouldn't say human skill has lost its importance, but it's definitely changed in nature. Today, being a good military pilot means understanding complex systems, interpreting real-time data, and making decisions in overloaded information environments. It's less about acrobatic maneuvers and more about information management and system coordination.
Now let's zoom out. This technological revolution we're seeing isn't limited to Eastern Europe, right? What impact could it have in other regions of the world?
The impact is global and profound. When countries around the world watch next-gen military systems being neutralized by adapted commercial tech, the message is crystal clear: you no longer need a superpower budget to have significant deterrence capability. This is literally redrawing the map of global military power.
Can you give concrete examples?
Sure. Iran is already exporting full drone kits to regional allies. Turkey has positioned itself as a hub for affordable military tech and is selling its systems to African and Asian countries. Taiwan has drastically increased its defense budget, focusing specifically on asymmetric systems to deter a possible Chinese invasion. It's an unprecedented wave of technological proliferation.
And that could speed up regional arms races?
It could, and it already is, but it's a different kind of arms race. It's not about who has more tanks or fighters, but about who can implement electronic response systems, cyber defense, and autonomous capabilities faster. A country like Pakistan can build significant area denial capabilities without having to compete directly with India in expensive conventional systems.
Does that make the world more dangerous?
It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it democratizes access to advanced military capabilities, which can destabilize regions. On the other hand, it can create power balances that make conventional wars less attractive. When everyone has the ability to cause serious damage at relatively low cost, diplomacy becomes more important.
And how are major military alliances adapting?
NATO is trying to reinvent itself, but it faces the challenge of coordinating 31 countries with very different capabilities and priorities. The traditional model of large military exercises is giving way to simulations of responses to distributed threats and saturation attacks. We've already seen exercises focused specifically on defense against drone swarms.
And on the Russian side, the CSTO?
The alliance led by Russia is learning a lot from the Ukrainian conflict. They're seeing firsthand how technological wars of attrition can be more effective than direct confrontations. That's shaping their military doctrines and their partnerships with countries like Iran and North Korea in the field of unmanned systems.
Looking to the future, what lessons can we take from this transformation?
The main lesson is that we're entering an era where agility and adaptability matter more than raw technological superiority. Countries that can quickly integrate commercial technologies into their military doctrines, that invest in training specialized operators, and that maintain constant innovation capacity are going to have the strategic edge.
Is this the end of traditional military superpowers?
Not the end, but definitely a major redistribution of global military power. The superpowers still have huge advantages in logistics, intelligence, and power projection. But now, medium powers and even non-state actors can challenge that supremacy in specific contexts. It's a militarily more complex world and, paradoxically, a more democratic one.
A democratization of military capabilities that brings both opportunities and risks.
Exactly. And the key to navigating this new environment is understanding that the rules have fundamentally changed. It's no longer about who has the most expensive gear, but about who can use the available technology more creatively and effectively. That's a lesson that applies not just to the military, but to anyone trying to understand how technology is reshaping power in the 21st century.
But Chris, looking ahead, because we can't just keep reacting, right? What kind of technological solutions are being developed to face this new reality of drone swarms and saturation attacks?
Man, now you've hit the point where things get really interesting. The answer isn't in building more of the same systems we already know, but in thinking completely outside the box. And that's where directed energy weapons come in, especially high-powered lasers. It's literally science fiction turning into reality.
Military lasers? Doesn't that sound a bit too futuristic?
I get the reaction, but lasers are already here. The US Department of Defense spends about $1 billion annually just on directed energy weapons. Lockheed Martin just got a contract to deliver 300 kilowatt laser systems to the US Army by 2027. To give you an idea of what that means, a laser like that can bring down a drone in seconds, and each shot costs only a few dollars.
A few dollars per shot against missiles worth thousands?
Exactly. That's where the military math makes perfect sense. An interceptor missile costs between $50,000 and $2 million, depending on the type. A laser shot costs between $1 and $10 in electricity. When you're facing swarms of 50 drones, the budget difference is astronomical. It's like having infinite ammo, as long as you've got electricity.
And are these systems already operational?
Some are in advanced testing phases. The US Navy is testing the Helios system, which has already shown the ability to shoot down drones and small missiles. The Army's got smaller 50-kilowatt systems already being evaluated in real scenarios. But what impresses me most is the speed of progress. In July this year, the Army ran tests in Oklahoma that showed 90% effectiveness against multiple targets.
And what about the role of artificial intelligence in all this?
AI is the brain that makes all this possible. Because you can't have a human operator trying to track and prioritize dozens of simultaneous targets. Onboard AI can identify threats, calculate trajectories, determine priorities, and execute interceptions in milliseconds. It's a total paradigm shift, from humans making decisions to humans supervising the machine's decisions.
Doesn't that raise ethical concerns? Machines deciding matters of life and death?
It's a legitimate concern, and one that's being heavily debated in military circles. But it's important to understand that we're talking about defensive systems, not offensive ones. AI is being used to protect, not to attack. And there's always a human in the chain of command who can step in. But honestly, when you've got seconds to react to multiple threats, machine speed can be the difference between life and death for soldiers and civilians.
And other countries are developing these technologies too.
Absolutely. And here's one of the most interesting cases: Israel. They're literally at the forefront of this technological revolution. The Iron Beam system, a defensive laser developed by Rafael, is set to go operational this year. Israel invested $500 million just into this system, and the US kicked in another $1.2 billion in funding.
Why is Israel so far ahead in this area?
Necessity, plain and simple. They've been facing saturation threats for years, from Hamas rockets to Hezbollah drones to Iranian ballistic missiles. The traditional Iron Dome works, but it's expensive. Each interception costs thousands of dollars. The Iron Beam will allow intercepts for just a few dollars each. It's a matter of economic and operational survival.
And is Israel sharing this technology?
Yes, and that's strategic. The US Army has already said it's interested in potentially acquiring the Iron Beam if Israeli tests prove successful. It's a tech partnership that benefits both sides. Israel develops and tests in real conditions, the US funds and then adapts for its own needs. It's a model of military cooperation that other countries are watching with great interest.
What other countries are in this tech race?
Turkey is investing heavily in autonomous systems and military AI. The UK's running naval laser programs. France is working on high-powered microwave systems. Even smaller countries like Singapore and South Korea are carving out niches in advanced military tech. It's a democratization of military innovation that's changing the global game.
And looking at the next 5 to 10 years, what transformations can we expect?
We're going to see full integration between lasers, AI, defensive drones, and electronic warfare systems. Picture a city shielded by an invisible network of autonomous lasers that can identify and neutralize any aerial threat in seconds. Sounds like science fiction, but the technology already exists. The challenge now is integration, miniaturization, and cost reduction.
Will that make conflicts more or less lethal?
Paradoxically, it could make them less lethal for civilians, but it's going to force militaries to rethink their strategies completely. When defense systems become nearly impenetrable, the nature of war changes. It could force more diplomacy, more cyber warfare, or it could drive the development of even more advanced weapons. We're at a technological turning point that's going to shape the next 50 years of global military strategy.
Chris, after everything we've discussed about what's happening in Ukraine, it's clear that the world of air defense has completely changed. But when you talk about reinventing these strategies, are we talking about a gradual change or a truly radical transformation?
Man, it's a radical transformation, no doubt about it. To give you an idea, Ukraine jumped from producing 20,000 FPV drones per month in 2024 to 200,000 per month in 2025. That's not just growth, that's an explosion. And what does that mean? That the old mindset of let's build one expensive defense system and it'll last 20 years simply doesn't work anymore.
That really is impressive. 200,000 per month. It's like every month is a new reality on the battlefield.
Exactly. And look, this isn't theory I'm talking about. According to data from the Royal United Services Institute, drones are already responsible for 60% to 70% of the damage inflicted on Russian equipment. In other words, we're witnessing in real time a change in the DNA of modern military operations. Today, air defense is no longer just about expensive interceptor missiles. It's about creating an ecosystem that can adapt to thousands of small threats that cost a fraction of what it costs to destroy them.
And that's where the issue of directed energy weapons comes in, right? You're always mentioning lasers. For our audience that might still think this sounds like science fiction, how real is this today?
Look, it's way more real than most people imagine. At the end of 2024, the US Navy successfully tested the Helios system against cruise missiles. And let me tell you why this is revolutionary. An interceptor missile can easily cost $100,000. A laser shot? Just a few dollars of electricity. Do the math.
Wow, the economics behind that are insane.
Exactly. The US Army is running exercises combining directed energy weapons with traditional kinetic systems, especially against swarms of small drones. The challenge now isn't proving that it works, that part's settled. The challenge is making these systems robust enough to operate in any climate, anywhere, without needing a nuclear power plant next door to keep them running.
And what about artificial intelligence? Because one thing is having the technology, another is letting it make life or death decisions on its own. How do we deal with that?
That's without a doubt the most complex issue of all. On one hand, you need speed. A swarm of 50 drones coming at you all at once doesn't leave enough time for a human operator to analyze each target individually. On the other hand, imagine if the system mistakes an Amazon delivery drone for a military threat. The chaos that would cause.
Exactly, and it's not just a technical issue, right? It's an ethical one too.
Yes, and that's why the most advanced systems today work with what we call a supervised decision loop. The AI identifies, classifies, and even recommends action, but there's still a human in the loop to give the final go. At least in the most critical situations. It's a delicate balance between efficiency and responsibility.
And who's leading this revolution? Because I imagine it's not just the countries with the biggest military budgets, right?
Interesting you ask that. Obviously Israel is still a reference point, mainly because of the practical experience they've got. But look at this, Ukraine made history by carrying out the world's first fully unmanned attack using ground robotic systems and FPV drones. That's innovation born out of necessity.
So it's really not just a superpower thing anymore.
Not at all. Countries like Estonia, Finland, even Ukrainian startups are creating solutions that billion-dollar companies couldn't. Why? Because they're testing in the field, in real time, with instant feedback. It's like comparing a research lab with an emergency room. Urgency accelerates innovation in a way that's just incredible.
Chris, as we come to the end of our conversation, I want to ask you a more personal question. If you could give one piece of advice to someone who's just starting to think about the future of defense, what would it be?
Learn to think in terms of systems, not isolated platforms. The future isn't about having the best drone or the best missile. It's about how all your systems talk to each other, how they adapt to threats in real time, and how you maintain information superiority over your opponent. And most importantly, never forget that behind all this technology, it's still human beings making the most important decisions.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing these perspectives with us. For those of you following along, I hope you've realized that we're living through a historic moment. The rules of the game have changed, and whoever understands that first will be better prepared to navigate this new world.
Thanks for having me. And remember, folks, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. The question is, do you want to be at the front or running to catch up?
Perfect, Chris. And for all of you who've been with us until now, thank you for your attention. Stay curious. Keep questioning, and most of all, keep paying attention to the world that's transforming all around us. See you next time. And if you want to keep getting the best videos on global geopolitics, covering all the most important military events, subscribe to the channel, because it exists for just one reason: to keep you well-informed, free from the manipulation of the mainstream media. Helping you become a well-informed person is my mission. In the video now showing on your screen, I reveal the disaster of Kim Jong-un in Ukraine. Click on the screen and check out.